When I landed the job in New York, I had no idea what was coming. I always thought working the night shift on the streets of Times Square would be simple. A little cleaning here, a quick sweep there, maybe even a bit of peace to think while all the tourists were tucked away in their hotels. But things aren't quite like that when you're on the overnight shift. The company's building was just a few blocks from Times Square, and on my first day, I was greeted by an old man with deep-set eyes that seemed to know more than they should. "The job's simple," he said, his voice rough, "but there are rules. Rules you need to follow, or you might end up like all the others." He gave a weak laugh, and as he passed by, handed me a piece of paper with a list on it. "First night, you start at 11. Follow the rules, and you'll be fine." I was tired, eager to start, but instead of relief, the night soon brought a strange feeling. The glow of the giant screens felt colder, more distant. They say the city never sleeps, but as the hours ticked by, I realized something wasn't right. When I entered the square for the first time, everything seemed normal. People were smiling, walking fast, soaking in the ads flashing on the screens. I was used to it, but what unsettled me was the way their gazes seemed to turn toward me, even if just for a second, like there was something, a presence, watching me. The first rule was written there on the list. Never look at the faces on the screens. I didn't quite get it. What could possibly be so bad about the advertising screens? But the unsettling feeling of being watched only grew stronger. When I looked back at the screens, I saw something strange. In the flashes of the ads, something, or rather, someone, seemed to appear for brief seconds, a shadow slipping into the reflections, disappearing before I could fully process it. "No, this can't be real," I muttered to myself, quickly turning away. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Whatever it was there, just waiting, watching. Time passed, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the details began to line up in strange ways. As the hours of the night dragged on, I saw the other workers. There weren't many, all with tired faces, looking as much a part of the scenery as the lights of Times Square themselves. But they seemed to know something I didn't quite understand yet. I was starting to wonder if this job was really worth it, if I truly knew what I had gotten myself into. That's when I heard the first knock. It came from the far end of the square, where the traffic was thinner. A metallic sound, like someone tapping a key against the grate of one of the closed shops. The knocks grew louder, echoing in the silence of the night, with a frantic rhythm that seemed to follow me. My eyes darted to the side, searching for something or someone, but there was nothing. The sound continued, like an inaudible voice in the back of my mind. I knew I should follow the second rule. Don't talk to the tourists after 2 a.m., but the sound of the knocks was driving me crazy. It was becoming impossible to ignore. Then, suddenly, the supervisor appeared. His eyes were locked on me, and he gave me a sharp look, as if he already knew what was happening. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice deep. I didn't know what to say, so I looked at the screens again, only to find an image that sent a chill down my spine. It was no longer the typical ad for perfume or movies. It was my own face, a clear, frozen reflection, with my eyes wide open, as if I were staring at something I shouldn't be seeing. "Don't do it," he whispered, his gaze fixed on the reflection. "Never look at the faces on the screens." In that moment, everything around me stopped making sense. The people on the street, the tourists, the glow of the lights, everything distorted. Something was coming, and I no longer knew how to escape. The supervisor quickly turned and pulled me to the side, dragging me to the end of the street. "You broke the rule. You looked. Now, you won't be able to leave here." He shoved me into a dark alley, and before I could react, he said in a grave tone, "You'll understand, but first, you need to know the other rules." Suddenly, The entire city seemed to spin around me. I was trapped, and nothing felt real anymore. What was happening with the faces on the screens? Who was watching me? And why were the rules so important? Now, you're going to start understanding, he murmured, while I tried to process what was happening. But then, what seemed to be a metal door opened in front of us, and I stepped through. It was there, in the absolute darkness, that I heard the sound. A muffled noise, but unmistakable. Knocks. They were coming from inside the door. And then I saw it. Something was waiting for me. The sound continued louder now, as the knocks grew more frantic. As I approached, something on the other side began to move. Something much more dangerous than I could have imagined. And then, suddenly, a soft voice whispered in the dark, "You broke the rule. Now, you're a part of it." I was frozen. The sound of the knocks echoed louder as I neared the door. Each blow seemed to resonate directly in the back of my mind, as if they were pounding on my very soul. The supervisor stepped away from the door, his hands trembling slightly, but he didn't look back. He knew what was about to happen. The soft voice that whispered in the dark still echoed in my mind. "You broke the rule. Now, you're a part of it." I tried to swallow the fear that paralyzed me, but the terror spread through my body like an electric current. "You need to understand," the supervisor said, his voice barely audible. "The first rule is the most important. Never look at the faces on the screens. They are like a window, and when you look at them, you end up seeing more than you should." But what's happening?" I asked, my voice coming out weaker than I would have liked. He stared at me with an empty look, as if I was the last one to understand a truth he already knew. "It doesn't matter what you know or don't know anymore. What matters now is that you can't leave." "Not anymore." He paused, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. "Not even I can leave." Before I could respond, the knocks on the door intensified. The door seemed to be giving way under the pressure of something inside, and with each knock, the atmosphere around us became thicker, more charged. The air turned cold, and a sense of claustrophobia enveloped me. I wanted to run, but the supervisor held me tight, preventing any movement. "You're already trapped here, just like all the others," he continued, his voice now weaker. "And when you break the rule, you become part of what's inside." I looked at the supervisor, trying to understand what he meant. But before I could ask more, the door swung open, revealing what was on the other side. The darkness was almost absolute, but I could feel the presence of something that wasn't human. From within the darkness, a figure appeared. It wasn't a man or a woman, but something distorted, something moving erratically, as if it was trying to adapt to its surroundings but couldn't. What terrified me the most was the face, or rather, the lack of one. Where a face should have been, there was only a smooth surface, like a screen, and I knew exactly what that meant. The figure took a step toward me, and the sound of the knocks now sounded like a scream. I could see the screen reflecting my image, but it wasn't me. It was a distorted version with wide, bulging eyes, a crooked smile, and a frozen expression of terror. My own reflection was looking at me, and I knew, with horrifying clarity, that something in that reflection was becoming real. "What is this?" I screamed, beginning to panic. I wanted to get out, to run far away, but the doors were already closed. There was no escape. "You can't leave. They never leave," the supervisor said, his voice carrying a sadness that cut deeper than any words. The being in front of us started moving, its presence making the air even thicker and more oppressive. The shadows around seemed to writhe, twisting as if the very space was being distorted. I wanted to scream, but something held me back. My body was frozen, incapable of reacting. "Now you understand," the supervisor whispered. "You looked at the screen, and now it's inside you. All the others, they became what the screen showed. They became part of it." He looked at the being in front of us, which had now stopped, watching us with that empty face. and you will become the same. The tension was unbearable. The being was only a few feet away now, and I felt an impending, threatening presence, as if something was closing in, waiting to swallow me whole. The shadows around us grew denser, more oppressive. The place seemed to be crumbling, consuming everything around it, and the reflection on the screen appeared to be distorting even more. That's when I heard a voice, not mine, but a familiar voice. It was my own voice, coming from the darkness, repeating a phrase I had never said. "I'm going to get out of here." That's what saved me. The only thing I knew was that if my voice could free itself from that reflection, maybe I could escape. I took a step forward, getting closer to the distorted figure, and tried to scream at myself. But the only thing that came out was a whisper, "I'm going to get out of here." Suddenly, the face on the screen flickered. It was no longer my distorted image. It was the supervisor's, but unlike before, he was no longer moving. His mouth was open, his eyes locked on me, and he was screaming. Not a normal scream. It was a muffled sound, as if he was trapped, as if he could no longer move. And as he screamed, the shadows began to move more aggressively. It was as if he was becoming part of that being, and I could see his form warping. I glanced at the door, knowing that if I didn't escape now, there would be no chance left. But as I took my first step back, an invisible force yanked me back to the center of the room. The being was closing in, every movement faster, more precise. I had no choice left. I had to break the rule, and soon, very soon, it would be too late. I was starting to understand, even if it was too late, the rule I had broken, the simplest yet most devastating one, was the reason I was here, trapped between shadows and terror. The reflection, the being in front of me, the door that couldn't be opened, it was all a consequence. I had looked at the screen, and now, the reflection no longer belonged to me. It was becoming real. The supervisor was disappearing before my eyes, his form distorting, as if the very fabric of space was collapsing around him. His expression, once filled with dread, became empty, expressionless. I wanted to scream, but my words were swallowed by the muffled sound that filled the space around us. There was no more air. The pressure in my chest grew, and a feeling of suffocation spread through every part of my body. The creature in front of me was getting closer, its erratic movements becoming faster, more unpredictable. With every step it took, it felt like it was warping the reality around us. The walls started to ripple, as if space itself was no longer solid, as if we were being pulled into something beyond. I had no idea what it was. Something so ancient and deep that just thinking about it made me want to close my eyes and never open them again. But I knew I couldn't. There was no way out anymore. I glanced at the supervisor for the last time and saw that he was now completely absorbed into the screen, his arms stretched out as if trying to reach something that was no longer there. He vanished with a snap, like a shadow being swallowed by an endless night. The creature then turned its attention back to me. Its hands, distorted and rigid, reached out slowly, almost as if they were trying to touch me, to pull me in. The reflection on the screen began to move. It was me, or at least it looked like me. My eyes were wide and glassy, my smile grotesquely twisted. I wanted to scream, but the words caught in my throat. The reflection was starting to push out of the screen, as if it was projecting itself into my world. What was happening? The creature made a sound that felt like a whisper in my mind, a voice that couldn't be heard, but could be felt, penetrating my thoughts and making me lose all sense of time and space. I could hear its words, but couldn't understand them. They were like a command, an invitation, a threat. You will become the reflection. You will be part of what you looked at. I tried to push the creature away, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as if I were paralyzed, as if I were made of the same substance as the room, the shadows writhing around us. Reality was beginning to unravel, merging with a darkness that was consuming everything. Every movement of the creature seemed to distort space even more, as if the world was being erased and rewritten. The reflection on the screen was now completely outside of it, and my eyes, My eyes were staring at me. I saw that smile widen, more crooked, deeper, until there was nothing left but an empty void. I knew that from that moment on, I was no longer me. I was being pulled into that reflection, into the screen, where I would become just another distorted being, a part of something that could no longer be separated. Suddenly, the pressure became unbearable. I screamed, a scream that seemed endless, and then everything went black. For a moment, everything was silent, an absolute, profound silence, as if time itself had stopped. There were no more knocks, no sound of the creature moving. I was in an emptiness. I woke up, or at least I thought I had. I no longer knew what was real. The feeling of being watched was inescapable. I looked around and realized the room was empty, but the screen was still there gleaming with the image of the supervisor, or what was left of him. He was there, contorted, his eyes wide open and his expression frozen in an eternal state of horror. I knew he was trapped there, just like all the others. But something was wrong. The screen flickered and something else appeared. It wasn't an image of someone, but a word, written in a strange way, as if it were being formed by something invisible, something that shouldn't be there. You're next. I tried to move away, but my body wouldn't budge. I was paralyzed again, and the feeling of something pulling me into the screen took over completely. It was a deep, insatiable void, and I knew that this time there would be no escape. I was the next one. Then the screen went black, and the last thing I heard was the sound of the knocks, louder than ever. Darkness consumed everything, and for a brief moment, I thought I was finally free. But the feeling of being trapped didn't go away. The silence was absolute, but it carried a heavy tension, as if something invisible was watching, waiting. My eyes adjusted to the dark, and as my mind began to clear, I realized I was in a place I didn't recognize. The environment was freezing, colder than any street in Times Square could ever be. The air was thick, and with every breath, the sensation of suffocation grew stronger. I looked around, but there were no walls, no ceiling. It was as if I were floating in an endless void, where time and space didn't exist. Yet, there was something familiar about this place, a feeling that I had been there before. I was no longer in my body, at least not in the body I knew. I could feel a presence around me, something that made my stomach churn and my heart race. The sensation of being watched was now stronger than ever. Every breath seemed amplified, and the sound of my heartbeat echoed in the void. Suddenly, a dim light appeared in front of me. It was faint, but enough to reveal a familiar figure, the supervisor. But he was different now, more distorted. His eyes were opaque, as if there was no life left in them. He stood there, immersed in the same darkness that surrounded me, and his movements were vague, almost as if he were being pulled by something invisible. He didn't seem to see me, but his presence was oppressive, like a shadow that followed me with every step. I tried to call out to him, but my voice wouldn't come. My throat was dry, as if I were swallowing shards of glass with every attempt to speak. The light around him began to pulse, illuminating more parts of the void. Now, I could see other figures, other people trapped in this limbo. Some were in strange positions, as if they had been turned into living statues, frozen in eternal agony. Their eyes were empty, as if their reflections had been ripped away, leaving only hollow, desolate shells. Then, I heard a voice, low and guttural, coming from somewhere deep within me. It was a voice that didn't belong to me, but it echoed in my mind as if it were a part of me long forgotten. "You can't escape." I turned quickly, trying to identify where the voice was coming from, but the void seemed to absorb everything. There were no more shadows, just an endless abyss. I was trapped more than ever. The voice continued, now clearer, closer. "You saw the reflection, and now the reflection will possess you." I didn't know how to react. I was paralyzed by helplessness, but a growing sense of urgency took over me. I needed to understand what was happening. I needed to escape something that was already beyond me. That's when I realized the supervisor, he had been the key. He was the transition, the point of transformation. Everything he had said, all the rules he had imposed, now made terrible sense. He had broken something inside of me, and now I was part of it. I no longer knew where I began and where the creature ended. The reflection, the screen. I didn't know if it was a portal or a prison anymore. Something inside me began to stir. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The feeling of being consumed was enveloping me completely. I needed to do something, anything. Somehow, I had to find a way to reverse what had happened. I closed my eyes, trying to calm my mind, but the creature's voice began to rise, becoming a muffled scream inside my head. You will become the reflection. You will be the next part of the screen. And then, amidst the chaos and darkness, the only thing I could hear was the sound of the knocking again. Each knock grew louder, closer, until I couldn't tell anymore if the sound was coming from inside me or from outside. I was about to lose everything. It was at that moment that the light shone once more, brighter and more intense. And before I could react, the figure of the supervisor disappeared into the darkness, and I was pulled into the screen, as if it were a wave dragging me to the bottom of an ocean of nightmares. Everything went dark. I no longer knew if I was alive. When the darkness completely surrounded me, I lost track of time. There was no sound, no light, only an absolute void. My body felt heavy, almost as if it were tethered to an invisible weight. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I could only feel a growing pressure in my chest, as if something was crawling inside me, trying to get out, trying to control me. That's when the screen appeared again, but it was no longer just any screen. Now, it seemed alive, pulsing like a heartbeat, breathing with its own rhythm, as if it were feeding off of me. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped somewhere far away, distant from me, as if it had been ripped from my body. I didn't know where I was anymore, but I knew I couldn't escape. The screen expanded, covering everything around me, and I was dragged into it. Every fiber of my being seemed to be pulled into that insane space. My vision began to distort, and I saw flashes of faces, empty eyes, and mouths screaming without sound. I didn't recognize any of them, but I felt a deep connection with the figures that appeared and disappeared on the screen, as if they were pieces of something I had already lost. The feeling of being devoured was unbearable. I knew I was being consumed, not physically, but in a deeper way. It was as if my soul was being erased, piece by piece, until nothing remained. Then, something touched me. It wasn't a physical touch, but a presence, something with intelligence, something that knew exactly who I was. I tried to close my eyes, but it didn't help. The presence was there in my mind, watching me, feeding on my fears, my anxieties. The feeling of being analyzed was overwhelming. Terror consumed me, and I knew something was getting closer, a shape I couldn't comprehend. That's when the voice returned. It was no longer guttural or distant. It was inside me now, deep in my mind, speaking directly to my soul. You thought you could escape, but you're already here. You're already part of all of this. I wanted to fight, I wanted to scream, but my words were trapped. The rules, the damn rules, which seemed harmless at first, now made sense in a terrifying way. They were a pact, a contract, something much bigger than I could understand. And I had signed it, unknowingly, but I had signed it. I remembered the supervisor's words, the 5 rules. Each one of them felt more real than ever. As I became part of the screen, I understood the horror in its true form. It was not a trap nor a prison. It was a cycle, a distortion of reality itself, pulling in souls like mine to perpetuate its existence. The lines between what was real and what was part of the screen blurred, and I could no longer distinguish myself from the endless reflections and shadows that surrounded me. The rules, the warnings, they were all true. I had ignored them, questioned them, tried to defy them, But now I was part of them, part of something far darker than I had ever imagined. The supervisor was never human. He was the keeper, the guide to this inescapable nightmare, a part of the screen itself, orchestrating the endless loop of consumption. And now, I too was trapped, lost in the void of the screen, becoming one of its many twisted faces. The laughter echoed, reverberating through every corner of my mind, fading slowly as I was swallowed by the darkness. No escape, no redemption, just the endless cycle of reflections, waiting for the next to come. The screen would never stop. It would always hunger, always consume, and somewhere, somehow, someone else would step into its grasp, not knowing they had already been chosen. The darkness that surrounded me felt endless, but somehow there was a shift. What seemed like an absolute void was interrupted by a strange sense of solidity, like I was being pulled toward the surface of something, a sharp movement, a pressure on my chest. I couldn't breathe, but something forced me to wake up. I opened my eyes, gasping for air, and found myself back in reality. Or at least, what seemed like reality. I was back on the street, lying on the cold asphalt, the lights of Times Square flashing around me, the sound of car horns, the noise of the crowd. Everything seemed normal, but something was terribly wrong. Something had changed. I got up, unsteady, feeling weak, like I had been drained. I tried to focus on the people, on the lights, but everything felt distant, faded, like I was seeing the world through a filter. And yet, something told me I wasn't the same. I wasn't me anymore. The screen was there, not visible, but present. I could feel it at every corner, in the flickering lights on the building facades, in the flashing advertisements, as if they were waiting for something, waiting for me. I touched myself, confused, and realized I still carried something on my body, a mark, a scar that hadn't been there before, a symbol like a code that seemed to glow faintly under my skin. My mind raced with the thought. I was still inside the screen. I started walking down the street, unaware of what I was doing, like a puppet with no control over my own movements. Tension filled every step, and the people around me began acting strangely. They didn't look at me, but their empty gazes followed my every move, as if they knew what I had done, as if they knew something inside me had broken, and there was no turning back. I saw the familiar silhouette. It was the supervisor. He was there, standing on the corner, wearing the same worn-out suit and that cynical smile. But now, there was something different about his presence, something far more threatening. He wasn't just watching me anymore. He was calling to me. He approached slowly, and I couldn't move my feet anymore. Something inside me told me he had brought me back, but not to freedom, to something far worse. "Did you think you could escape?" he said, his voice echoing in my mind in a way that didn't seem human. I tried to scream, but the word didn't come out. He leaned in closer to look at me, and his eyes, now without pupils, glowed with a fierce red. "Now you're part of the screen, and you'll never get out, no matter how much you fight." I couldn't run anymore. The rules weren't just physical limitations. They were a prison for the soul, and now I was a prisoner. The worst part was that, at that moment, I knew the game wasn't over. What I saw, what I lived, all that was part of the screen that would never stop, the screen that was already consuming my essence. But there was something inside me, something small, a spark of resistance that refused to accept this truth. Something still trying to fight, still trying to find an escape. But when I looked at him, I saw the shadow of 1,000 other faces, all those lost souls trapped inside the screen, all waiting to feed. And that's when I realized the last rule wasn't a rule, but a warning. I wasn't supposed to look at the supervisor, because he was the key to the end of my freedom, the end of my sanity. But he had already become part of me, and I no longer knew where I ended and where he began. I wondered, as the supervisor smiled, if anyone ever had truly escaped, and if the screen in the end was just an illusion to keep us trapped, forcing us to follow the rules. never knowing we were already part of it from the very beginning. The supervisor kept looking at me with that victorious smile, his red eyes pulsing as if with every beat of his heart. The screen expanded further, swallowing everything around it. I was frozen, unable to move a muscle. The feeling that my own actions no longer belonged to me, that I was being controlled by an invisible force, intensified with every second. This wasn't the world I had lived in before. This place, now, was an eternal nightmare. I tried again to fight the pressure, to push back against the weight crushing my mind. Something inside me, that small spark of resistance, still burned. If I couldn't escape physically, maybe I could find a way out another way. But how? I looked at the scar on my skin, the symbol now glowing with its own light. It was the key. What did it mean? Why was it there? I needed to understand. I needed to figure out what that mark represented, what it was trying to tell me. And then, as if a revelation had lit up in my mind, everything became clear. The symbol wasn't just a physical marker. It was a connection, an invisible line that linked all those who had been consumed by the screen. Like me, each of them had left a trace, a mark, a way to identify those who were trapped. The screen wasn't just a physical space. It was a field of forces, a mental prison that fed on us, on our emotions, our fear, our doubts. I wasn't alone. I had never been. Those who were in the screen, the other lost souls, were fighting with me, trying to give me the strength to escape. It was a collective, silent, desperate effort, but it was clear now. I had to confront the supervisor, face him in a way he didn't expect. The screen was powerful, but there was still something stronger inside me. The fear he had planted, the crushing sense of helplessness, was no longer enough to control me. I took a step forward, stronger, more determined. The supervisor stepped back slightly, the smile on his face disappearing as the power he had over me began to weaken. He seemed to sense the change, the growing resistance inside me. "Do you think you can defeat me?" he asked, his voice now distorted, threatening. "I don't care if I can defeat you," I replied, my voice firm, without hesitation. "What matters is that I will try. And even if I can't, I'll keep trying." He laughed, a dry, cynical sound that echoed down the empty street. The lights around us began to flicker erratically, as if they were on the verge of collapse. Everything seemed to be crumbling, the screen breaking down around us. But I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready. Suddenly, the supervisor stepped forward, trying to grab me. But in that moment, something changed inside me. I felt the power of resistance, the accumulated anger, the need to break the limits imposed by the screen. I didn't know if it would be enough, but I was willing to do anything to end that nightmare. With a quick gesture, I touched the symbol on my skin, and in the next instant, a wave of energy surrounded me. The screen began to distort, as if it were being eaten away from the inside. The supervisor tried to scream, but his voice dissolved before any sound could escape his mouth. He was losing control, and that gave me strength. And then everything collapsed. The screen shattered like broken glass, and the world around me began to disappear slowly until there was nothing left. Not the supervisor, not the street, not the lights of Times Square. Nothing. I woke up in a dark room, alone, with the sensation of having been thrown back into reality. But was this really reality? Or just a new layer of the screen, disguised to deceive me? I could still feel the weight of the mark on my skin. Still felt that something was there, watching, waiting. I had escaped, but the real question was, had I really escaped? In the depths, a voice whispered in my mind, a voice that wasn't mine. "You'll never escape. The rules are meant to be followed. The game never ends." And as much as I wanted to believe I was free, I knew that somehow the screen was still there. Maybe deep down, I was still trapped. The screen was watching me, and I knew that at any moment it could call me back.